Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It is the 17th of January, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your Alaska weather no matter where you're watching from tonight. We thank you, we welcome you, and glad you're here. As always, you can check in for the forecast at 1-800-472-0391. Find us online at weather.gov/Alaska. And if you can't find what you're looking for, email me, david.snider@noaa.gov. And as I've been saying the last couple days, I may not be able to reply right away, but if you have a question or concern about the show and want to give me your suggestions, I'll get back to you just as soon as the shutdown is over. But if it's a question about the weather and what's happening right now, I can answer that. I'll be right back with you as soon as I possibly can. Here's a look at what's going on across the region. As we look at the northern Gulf, area of high pressure right across south central, Prince William Sound, and up around Yakutat still is creating that threat for some dense fog. And as that threat continues, we expect to see dense fog in the region as we go into early tomorrow morning. And we've been looking at fog around Cordova most of the day. We expect that it may form around the Copper River Valley and into parts of Cook Inlet. So if that impacts your travel in any way or your travel decisions going forward, make sure you're factoring that in there. It looks like, again, visibility could be poor and ceilings may be low as we go into the morning hours for many concerns around the northern Gulf from Yakutat westward into Cook Inlet. Now, conditions have been improving a little bit across southeast after a couple days worth of fog there, but other than that, really no watches, warnings, or advisories to pass on to you tonight. As we look at the satellite picture, you can see one wave of weather is moving up from the Pacific Northwest. The main core of the jet stream is well to our south right now, so Anchorage and Juneau and Fairbanks are just kind of doing their own thing here with the weather just kind of slowly meandering through. The big controlling feature that I'm seeing right now is high pressure a little bit closer to the surface and aloft that's bringing that southeasterly flow out across most of the state. What we're going to see develop here is a very broad offshore flow for most of the west coast following a trough of low pressure that's organizing right now. In fact, it's gathering enough cold air behind it. We might even consider this more of a cold front as it works its way east, where you can get kind of a sense of it forming right here. But for right now, today, we're still seeing that steady southeasterly flow feeding into low pressure up across the Chukchi. Now, because of the high pressure that's been forming across the northern Gulf, we have seen those areas of fog forming, and otherwise generally clear skies are found around south central well into the northern Gulf. But south of that, that onshore flow to the Aleutian chain as well as the Aleutian mountains themselves and the Aleutian range, still producing some rain and snow all the way around Sand Point and the higher terrain there up toward Lake Iliamna. And we're seeing some pockets of snow across the west coast. What we're going to notice, though, in time as this flow becomes a little more westerly, at least for a while, north of the Alaska Range and into the interior, is we're going to allow another storm to form here across the North Pacific. That moves into the central and western chain and continues to strengthen as we go toward the weekend. So if you're west of Adak and Atka, probably want to keep an eye on that one. Here's a look at the weather map this afternoon. Low pressure sitting across the Pacific Northwest. This is one of the stronger lows right now that we've seen this close to the Pac Northwest so far this winter. 982 millibars, not an Alaska beast by any stretch, but it is certainly going to get their attention there with more wind. As we look across the Alaska Range, we've got a weak frontal boundary just kind of parked right here. This is really the boundary between big cold or bigger cold and the milder cold of winter across south central and southeast. Notice the pressure gradient here has been up a little bit across southeast too. And here's our trough of low pressure extending all the way from the Gulf into the Arctic. On the east and west side of that line, some pockets of snow have been falling, but nothing too substantial. As this starts to shift eastward a little bit more with high pressure building across the Bering Sea, I think we can safely call this a cold front. Out across the Norton Sound region into Kotzebue Sound, Point Hope and Point Lay, we expect to see a little bit of light snow falling along this, but the front itself really isn't going to make any big dramatic changes to anybody's life. It looks like as this starts moving eastward a little bit, it weakens very, very quickly, so its life is fairly short-lived. Across the Alaska Peninsula, pockets of rain and snow should be expected there. The trough across the Gulf is well to the south of most of Alaska's interests. Clouds will start to build in a little bit more from Sitka southward toward Craig, Ketchikan, Klawock, Metlakatla. Probably areas north still looking at generally dry conditions, but you're also going to be dealing with a little more wind. Where the wind lets up just enough, fog will probably pop in there pretty quickly around Cook Inlet, Cordova, and all the way out toward Yakutat. A weak disturbance here around the Alcan, Eagle, Northway, perhaps looking at some snow showers in your vicinity. And we're still talking about the wind around the central and eastern Beaufort Seacoast, Kaktovik, maybe as far west as Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse, but we're not looking at any obscuration to visibility at this time. Why? Probably because a lot of the snow's been blown away. Out across the west, a 983 millibar low will organize. This will probably strengthen to strong gales, maybe low-end storms south of the Aleutians, but worth keeping watch on for Friday's weather. As high pressure creeps eastward toward the YK Delta, we're going to develop a little bit of a stronger outflow or push off of shore. So this was going to be a pretty dry situation, I think, for most of the YK. Cool, but certainly a drier situation. Now the cold front is gradually creeping eastward and weakening as it goes. We're still looking at kind of a blustery situation across the eastern Beaufort Seacoast, and we're also making room for the next weather maker to move a little bit further north across southern parts of southeast. This trough of low pressure isn't really a whole lot warmer behind it, so we're going to keep it as a trough. No big temperature change with it, but it may stir up the wind. It may stir up some precipitation across southern areas, and right now around the Misty Fjords, probably the best chance of seeing some lighter snowfall in that area. Out to the west, our low still looking at about 983 millibars. You can see that tight packing of the pressure gradient, maybe not as tight as what we see here around the Lynn Canal, but southerly winds will be picking up as it feeds into that storm across the western Bering and the western chain. Here's a look at Saturday now. That low is pretty much in the same old spot out here around the Kamchatka Peninsula. It is deepening to about 961 millibars. And as it does so, it's going to swing an occluded front up through the central chain. That'll probably stir up some more wind and a little bit of light rain and snow for most areas out there. For southeast, that trough is still just kind of creeping its own way right through southeastern Alaska. Again, the low pressure systems aren't terribly strong, but it's also the relativity to high pressure out here across the Alcan border and Eagle and Northway at 1,018 millibars. So that difference shows up pretty sharply here around the Lynn Canal, and once again Haines and Skagway, maybe Juneau, looking at a little more wind as we start up your Saturday. Around Prince William Sound and the Knik River Valley all the way down into Cook Inlet, probably looking for some wind there as well as Saturday moves in, but it will be a generally clear state for most of the Copper River Valley, all the way down to Kodiak Island and a large part of the west coast as dry air moves off the continent, moves toward the west coast. It should keep the sky generally clear there. Now, that is good news if we have some clouds lingering in the region. Any region for that matter on Saturday night, there is a lunar eclipse that you probably would love to see if it's not terribly cold and not terribly cloudy. So make sure you take a moment to look up, as Jack Horkheimer of Stargazers would say. Out across the west, that front will continue to move very slowly. You'll notice the ridge of high pressure that we see all the way across eastern Asia is really anchored across the Bering. So that's our next big mountain to overcome in the weather world as far as weather patterns go for the Alaska region. Let's take a look at temperatures as we get into your Friday morning. For southeast, 20s to about 30 degrees for many areas along the outer coast of southeast. Up toward Yakutat with fog, 24, teens around Cook Inlet, again with the potential of fog there. Cordova, 20 and foggy overnight. 16 below in Fairbanks, that's possible. 30 below around Fort Yukon, and when you look at the North Slope, anywhere from 5 to about 15 below. Prudhoe Bay, Dead Horse Workers, about 14 below for you tonight. 12 in Kotzebue, 11 around Nome, and for Southwest, look for temperatures in the teens, maybe about 20 degrees around Kings Salmon and Dillingham. Around the Alaska Peninsula, 20s and 30s there. We get a little bit warmer as you get into the Pacific Coast, 36 degrees around Sandpoint, 30 in Unalaska, Dutch Harbor, 23 in St. Paul, Adak, Atka, close to 30 degrees for tomorrow morning. High temperatures there back in the mid-30s, 27 around St. Paul, and as you look out toward Bethel, expect a high temperature tomorrow around 14 degrees, Grayling. Russian Mission areas, probably low to mid-teens there. Unalakleet, about 17, 14 in Nome, 11 for Shishmaref. The North Slope, looking at temperatures tomorrow in the single digits, but on the plus side of 0. That'll be a change there. One exception, though, it looks like these have minus signs. Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse and around closer to 5 below. Around the Middle Tanana Valley and Fairbanks, 8 below, so certainly cold there, and 3 above in Eagle. 20s for most of the Cook Inlet region, and Talkeetna looking at 22. Southeast, 20s and 30s for you, Sitka, closer to 37. Overnight lows getting colder. Remember I said that high pressure was pushing that colder air westward? Well, here it comes, and you can see it pouring into the interior and down the valleys into the upper Kuskokwim. McGrath back to 17 below, Galena 15 below, 7 below, and Ambler. Bettles looking at 16 below, and not a whole lot warmer down in Tanana. The Middle Tanana Valley 15 below, Fort Yukon 24 below, and 5 to 15 below across the North Slope. We'll still hold on to some milder weather here across the west coast. Nunivak Island and Macoriac looking at 6, St. Lawrence Island villages around 9. Teens and 20s for the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak 33. These are all low temperatures now, and teens and 20s for most of southeast with a few outer coast temps near 32. The Cook Inlet region in the single digits. Here are your highs for Saturday. Looks like 30s to maybe 40 degrees for a large part of southeast, Yakutat 33. 20s for the Prince William Sound region, back into the teens for Cook Inlet, Anchorage, Palmer, Wasilla, 37 in Kodiak. 20s and 30s for most of the Alaska Peninsula, 27 for St. Paul and St. George, 36 on Unalaska Dutch Harbor, warming to 21 below for Fort Yukon, 11 below. In Fairbanks, up north, you're looking at temperatures from 5 to 10 below. Nome, about 11 above, and 19 above for our St. Lawrence Island friends. Here's a look at the climate outlook now. This is the period 8 days from now, ending on the 31st, the end of the month, and this tells us we are going to be into a warmer pattern. Chances are that's what's going to happen. So warmer than average conditions, most likely here around the Kenai Peninsula, Prince William Sound, northern sections of southeast, all the way into the southern interior, and warmer signals or a warmer chance, but maybe not quite as solid thinking there across the north and western coast. As we look at precipitation, also looking toward an above average trend for some parts of the northern interior and the northern coast, also across the Copper River Valley and into sections of southeast. So right now the climate trends are telling us that slightly or much above normal temperatures for south central are possible, and wetter conditions than normal are possible for the north and central interior and again the northern Gulf Coast. So always check this out at cpc.gov.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And on to your flying weather now. IFR conditions are to be a little more widespread around the western Gulf into Bristol Bay and some of the higher terrain in southwestern Alaska. We're also going to see more areas across the upper Yukon Flats into the upper Tanana Valley develop IFR conditions. We're still dealing with fog this morning and this afternoon across northern parts of the Gulf and southeast and central and southern parts of southeast. Still just can't shake free of the fog we've been dealing with now for the past 2 days. Out across the west, some breaks in the MVFR that you'll see here and also across the central chain. Some parts of the west coast also looking at a little bit of improvement as we get into Friday morning, especially from Nome all the way down to the extreme western parts of the Yukon and Kuskokwim deltas out toward Etolan Strait. That should improve even more as we get into Friday. You'll notice many more breaks across the western Alaska Range, south central into the Copper River Valley, and then across the eastern Brooks Range. But do notice that widespread MVFR will be pretty prevalent there from Atkasuk up toward Nuiqsut and also up toward Utqiagvik and then north toward Wainwright, all the way down into the upper end of the Kobuk and Noatak valleys, maybe just outside of Kotzebue and just east of Shishmaref, not including, again, areas around Nome out toward Golovin. Things look to be generally VFR there. We are going to bring back in MVFR for central and southern parts of southeast. Higher terrain, especially in the Misty Fjords, looking at IFR conditions, and we'll still have some lingering IFR across the Aleutian Range in the Alaska Peninsula. For your Saturday morning, VFR a little more widespread then as you get out toward St. Paul and St. George, west and southwestern Alaska, the middle Yukon Valley out toward the Seward Peninsula, the western end of the Kobuk and Noatak valleys closer to the coast, and then also the Copper River Valley. But notice southeast now starting to fill back in with MVFR and fairly widespread IFR from Sitka and then eastward as you head just south of Juneau there. So watch for some changes in southeast as we get through the morning. That should improve a little bit as we get into the afternoon, but still looking at least MVFR for most areas with VFR across the southern half, if not the southern third around southwest, south central, and a good chunk of the Aleutians as well as North Slope communities looking at MVFR most likely. IFR conditions there just west, it looks like, of Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass for Saturday. Here's your pass conditions for tomorrow, your Friday. Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass. Looks like we're going to see VFR to start, but then a gradual shift over toward MVFR conditions as your day goes on. Lake Clark and Mail Pass, I think, will start out at IFR, but probably lean over to an improving situation, maybe as far as VFR conditions go, so watch for that change. Rainy Pass, we look at marginal conditions to start the day with VFR to wrap it up, so slight improvement there. Windy Pass may start at VFR conditions throughout your day. Isabel Pass, probably VFR to start. As you move eastward, though, we'll get into Mentasta Pass with IFR and MVFR probably in the afternoon, so some improvement there. A little bit further south, Tenita Pass looks pretty good right now. VFR conditions tomorrow. Portage Pass right now looking to be VFR for your Friday. Chilkoot Pass, it may be this close. Chilkoot may be VFR most of the day, with White Pass holding on to MVFR conditions there as you go throughout your entire Friday. And then as we saw Saturday, looks a lot different. The freezing levels for your Friday morning shows that a slug of warmer air is kind of moving its way westward, but not so far northward. You can see west of the Alaska Range into parts of the inner Bristol Bay, south of Kodiak Island, levels there 2,000 to 4,000 feet. And you can also see some warmer air nudging up to about Port Alexander and over the Dixon entrance at about 4,000 feet. Plus also just a hint of warm air up across the North Slope. Icing potential is generally thin. You see this boundary here. This is all ahead and along a frontal boundary that's moving in from the west. That'll come working its way in. So do expect levels there much lower in the north, above 1,000 feet. And the moisture is slim, so you can probably get away from it pretty quickly. All the way down towards southwestern Alaska, above 9,000 feet. Above 8,000 feet, fairly widespread for southeast, and a new layer developing out across the west above 4,000 feet. Here's the jet, and it really hasn't changed position too much since yesterday. Superhighway of weather is well to our south, and the controlling features over Alaska are very not strong. So we've got southerlies working over southeast and winds coming in from the south across the North Slope, but no big strong push over the mainland itself. But 9,000 feet, northerlies are in control of the western communities, 20 to 25 knots, much stronger there across the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island. Low pressure pushing wind offshore of the North Slope, and south and easterly winds over southeastern Alaska. At 3,000 feet, winds are a little less strong here, 15 to, let's say 20 knots or so. And northerlies coming down the west coast, 30 to 40. You can see 50 to 55 knots out across the western Aleutians on the west side of that high pressure system. So as those winds strengthen up a little bit, we're going to see patches of considerable moderate across west and southwestern Alaska, the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern chain, as well as the western chain, generally below 4,000 feet, and a little bit of a bump across the eastern Beaufort seacoast. We'll be back in a few.
Two bears and two dogs. Greetings, stargazers. I'm James Albury, director of the Kika Silva Pla Planetarium in Gainesville, Florida.
And I'm Dean Regas, astronomer for the Cincinnati Observatory. We're here to help you find your way around the sky. Every winter you can find two bears and two dogs in the stars.
That's right, Dean. The bears are called Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, while the dogs are called Canis Major and Canis Minor.
Each pair of constellations is visible in different parts of the sky, and we can show you tricks to finding them easily.
Let's show you. Okay, we have our sky set up for 9:30 p.m. anytime this week facing north. We're going to start by finding the two bears in the sky, Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. One is really big, bright, and easy to find, while the other is smaller, fainter, and almost impossible to find.
But before you go looking for bear shapes in the stars, let's start simple. A little to the northeast, you'll find one of the most recognizable star shapes in the sky. It's standing on its handle, as it has done every winter evening for thousands of years. It's the Big Dipper.
Now, the Big Dipper is not an official constellation. It's more of an unofficial constellation we called an asterism. The Big Dipper is only part of the larger constellation Ursa Major, or the Great Bear.
Wow, that's a big bear. And although it might be tough to imagine a giant bear with a head, paws, and claws up there, just remember that the Big Dipper marks the big bear's rear end and tail.
You can use the Big Dipper to find the little bear. Connect the dots on the two stars at the end of the spoon, what we call the pointer stars, and continue that line to the left. You'll run smack dab into a star of similar brightness. This is Polaris, aka the North Star, and it marks the end of the asterism commonly called the Little Dipper, or the tip of the tail for the constellation Ursa Minor, the Little Bear.
The two bears are not always in this configuration. As the night moves on, the Big Bear circles with the Little Bear around one focal point, the North Star, Around and around they go. Now we're facing southeast at 9:30 p.m. and this is the area of the sky where the two dogs live. With a little help, you can find them even easier than the two bears. First, look higher in the sky for the second most recognizable stars in the sky. 3 stars in a row, Orion's belt. Other stars mark as shoulders, feet, and head, but hey, this isn't Orion's show, so let's get back to the dogs.
You can use Orion's belt stars as pointers, just like the stars in the Big Dipper. Connect the dots on these stars and continue the line down and to the left. You'll come to the brightest star in the sky, Sirius, who twinkles, shimmers, and flashes all sorts of colors when it's low in the sky.
Sirius marks the nose of the big dog constellation Canis Major. Sirius is a star larger and hotter than our sun, but shines really bright because it's one of the closest stars to us, at only about 8.8 light years away.
That's still like 50 trillion miles, but some of Orion's stars are 50 to 150 times farther than Sirius.
To find the little dog, look up and to the left of Sirius and you'll find another bright star called Procyon. Procyon is part of the little dog constellation Canis Minor. Aw, what a cute little doggy.
Canis Minor is not as impressive as his bigger brother. Actually, the tiny constellation only has 2 stars in it, but when you include nearby Gamesa. How do you picture a dog in just 2 stars?
It must be a hot dog. So now you know how to find 2 bears and 2 dogs among the evening skies this January.
Ursa Major and Ursa Minor are in the northern sky after dark, with the Big Dipper acting as your guide.
And Canis Major and Canis Minor are hanging out in the southeastern sky with Orion's belt pointing the way.
Check them out all winter long. Who knows what other celestial creatures you'll see when you keep looking up.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And on to your marine weather now, the start at Ice Edge, and you'll notice that we've still got some marginal ice zones here, generally north of the YK Delta, north of the Etolan Strait area, and north of Amonic, a little bit forming here, very close to the coast of Unalakleet and just to the west there. Again, this is all due to that offshore ice or offshore flow that's pushing the ice pack away from the outer coast. So we expect more of this to kind of reform and seal up, but for right now, the ice concentration is lower because of that overall offshore flow, and that's going to continue for the next couple days. We've also seen a reduction in the ice analyzed there around the Kachemak Bay area, so good news for you folks with boats moored around the Homer Spit region, but we're also seeing that Cook Inlet ice is moving a little bit further southward in the last day or so, so something to keep track of there. No significant change in the distance there between the ice pack and St. Matthews, still running around 35 to about 40 nautical miles to the high concentration ice, the marginal ice zone just a little bit closer than that, but strips are moving off and away from that, so keep that in mind as you crabbers and fishers are out there, and certainly be safe. Let's take a look at the southeast wind and wave forecast. Notice those gusts that we were talking about with the wind. Yeah, that's there. 50-knot winds out of the Lynn Canal, 7-foot seas, 35 knots. Southeasterlies across the Clarence Strait with 4-foot seas expected, and generally an offshore flow from Yakutat all the way down to Craig, 15 to 25 knots. You're looking at about 8 to 11-foot seas. As we get into Saturday, the northerlies stay with us around the Lynn Canal, still looking at gusts to 50 there with a 7-foot sea. Northerlies push into Stevens Passage, and easterlies across the Clarence Strait. Northeasterly offshore winds from 15 to 25, looking at 8 to 11-foot seas across the outer coast. South Central, a northeasterly flow for just about everyone. Gusts out of the Copper River Basin, 30 knots with a 20-knot sustained wind and 6-foot seas. Northeasterlies light inside of Prince William Sound, 2-foot seas there. About the same for the northern Cook Inlet, but north and easterlies coming down past the Barrens will pick up a little bit more, 15 knots for the eastern Barrens. Those turn a little bit more northerly on Saturday with a 6-foot sea. Northeasterly winds inside and outside of Prince William Sound. 2-foot seas on the inside, that's not too bad, and 2 to 5-foot seas as you head down Cook Inlet. Outside of Resurrection Bay, 6-foot seas, but only a 10-knot wind coming in from the north. For Bristol Bay, it looks like we've still got some ice there around Cape Newenham and then south and east, a little bit building down past Port Hayden along the coast. Northerlies 25 to 35 with seas up to 13 feet as you head down the Bering Sea coast. Northeasterly winds there around Kodiak Island, 4-foot seas inside of Shelikof Strait, higher seas as you move south of Sand Point and west. For Saturday, northerlies really don't change a whole lot. 15 to 20 knot winds there, looking at about 6 to 7 foot seas across some of the outer coast areas. Inside Shelikof Strait, 3-foot seas expected. Northeasterlies down the Bering Sea coast, 25 knots with a 6 to 8 foot sea as you head into Saturday. Now remember, we've got that strong southerly wind building out across the western chain. There it is, a southerly wind, 40 knots sustained, 17 to 22 foot seas there. Everywhere else, really not too bad considering, 20 to about 35 knots there, but you do notice a sharp increase here across the eastern chain. 35 to 40 knot winds, 13 to 14 foot seas expected there on Friday. That improves for Saturday with easterly flow feeding in and the strongest winds still building from west of Adak all the way out towards Shemya and Attu Island. Anywhere from about 35 to 50 knots, sustained winds 40 to 50 with seas 21 to 29 feet. Could be even higher there. You can see some of the yellow poking in there. That's pushing that 30-foot sea range very quickly as you head west of Kiska. Let's take a look at the west coast, and winds will be a little bit more light here as they're reorienting to that stronger offshore flow that's coming in. Northwesterlies light over the ice around Norton Sound down toward Nunivak Island. Northeasterlies around St. Matthew, 10 knots, 9-foot seas. And northeasterlies a little stronger from St. Paul to St. George up toward Nunivak Island, 25 to 30 with that 7-foot sea. And again, we're still waiting for that offshore push to start to move in. You'll look for generally light winds over the ice, 5 knots in fact around Norton Sound, 20 knot to 30 knot winds from St. Matthew down toward the Pribilofs with 11-foot seas expected on Saturday. Your marine forecast for the north, 20 to 35 knots with an east and southeast flow, a light south and westerly flow coming up the Chukchi coast with 15 knots there. A little more light and variable on Saturday in the same location with more of an easterly flow developing at 15 knots for Prudhoe Bay, Kaktovik, around the Bering Strait region, northerlies at 10 knots, a little bit of a break for St. Lawrence Island. Here's a recap of tonight's weather. A little push of colder air is trying to make its way in from the west, but the big push really comes in from the east with high pressure building in, which could mean better air quality for Fairbanks there if you're keeping track of that. Winds will be a little bit breezy around, say, southeast, and we do expect to see some fog with a dense fog advisory around Yakutat. Probably looking at fog around Cordova and the Cook Inlet region overnight. Look for a storm to build out across the west and generally clear conditions for the central and western parts of Alaska as we go into the weekend. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.